one of our more informative workshops, must admit, and always look forward to our community development workshop and some of the information accession when it comes to housing today in Battle Creek. At this time, is there any public comment? Is there any public comment at this time? I'm not seeing any public comment. I'm going to turn it over to Ted Deering, our Assistant City Manager. Ted, and for
Thank you,
purpose
Mayor.
of introductions.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. And Community Development, which is a division of the Community Services Department, is the division that actually manages the grant funds we receive from the federal government that are primarily used to provide services to low and moderate income families in our community. And Chris Lucier and his team are very good at gathering data and interpreting data. They do a very good job of community engagement. And they're very strategic in their approach on how they spend the dollars and how they track the impact in our community. And because the work is somewhat complex and informative, as you indicated, Mayor, we occasionally ask community development to provide an overview of their work, particularly when we have new commissioners. So Chris is here this evening to talk a little bit about community development and to answer your questions. So I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Ted. So my name is Chris Lucier, Community Development Manager, and I have with me Michelle Salazar, who's Community Development Specialist, and has some of the responsibilities for putting together our annual action plans and managing some of our grants, both in-house and ones that we put out to subrecipients in the community. So this presentation, when we do give it, we typically give it in January every year because that's the beginning of our planning cycle. And that's a cycle that involves the City Commission. So this gives us an opportunity right at the front end to get some exposure, to give you an idea of sort of where we're at the beginning of that planning cycle. Community development basically does two things. We administer state and federal housing and community development grants, and we do planning around both how those grants are implemented in the community, but we also do planning around, we do community needs assessment, housing assessments. We take an inventory and do consultations with, nonprofit organizations, churches, other service providers, anyone who's in the community development ecosystem. And we report on that to HUD, and we take some responsibility for helping to coordinate some of those activities. We're responsible for putting together a 5-year consolidated plan. This basically lays out how we plan to use state and federal funds for the purposes of community development and housing. It also serves as our application for funds for the first year of that plan. And then subsequently, we put together 1-year annual action plans that update that plan or articulate how we'll spend grant funds each year. That, again, becomes our application to HUD for the funds that we'll receive. This is our staff. About 6 or 7 years ago, we had 2, sometimes 3 people on the team, and now we're a team of 8. Everybody but myself and Shauna Gamble, who is in the lower left-hand corner, are new to their positions in the last 6 to 8 months. So we've had a fair amount of turnover and have a lot of folks learning some new responsibilities. But it's a great group of folks. And we're also, last year when we gave this presentation, we had just moved into room 104 downstairs, so we've been in that location for a year. We like it because it puts us right, real close to the front door. We're accessible to the public. We used to be on the 3rd floor and hard to reach. Now we can be really close to clients. We've tried to put some of our information on the outside of our office so that folks coming in to conduct other business have an opportunity to be exposed to our programs, made aware of those things, or can be easily directed to us if they've got a need. If they're coming out of code compliance or inspections or have some issue with housing, we're a resource for those folks. This is a list of the funds that from state and federal sources that we manage. We receive community development block grant dollars in the amount of $1.2 million, typically between $1.2 and $1.3 million a year. Community development block grant dollars are pretty flexible funds. They can be used for a wide variety of community development purposes, not just housing activities. So we can fund some public services. We can provide some assistance around homeless needs. We can do facility development, streets repairs. There's a bunch of different things that can be used with those funds, or done with those funds. The home investment program can be used just for housing activities. So it's either renovating housing, doing infill, new housing development in low and moderate income neighborhoods, providing down payment assistance, or providing tenant-based rent assistance. So somewhat limited in what we can do with that. We have 2 different lead grants, one funded through the state of Michigan, the other one funded through HUD. Altogether, we have about $2.6 million that we spend each year just doing lead abatement activities. And then we have 2 special allocations that we've received in the last year or 2. One is called HomeARP, which is sort of a combination of those home affordable housing activities, but with a focus on helping people that are homeless. And the other was a CARES Act special CDBG allocation where we funded a bunch of activities that help folks with issues that arose out of the pandemic. So the HomeARP grant, we're just getting started. I think actually some of your first actions were to approve some of our HomeARP grants that we were providing to subrecipients. And the CDBG CV grants, we're just concluding. We've got a couple of them that are still open that we're working on. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the impact of those grants in a minute. This is our planning cycle. So tonight we'll have a community needs public hearing at the City Commission. We do a fair amount of data analysis. We do consultations with local organizations, attend other community meetings as a way of getting information that supplements our planning work. We also look at a fair amount of data about how our neighborhoods are doing or around community needs, and we'll share some of that in a little bit. Starting in January, we begin to put together our annual action plan. We'll publish a budget and make that available for public comment. There'll be a public hearing on that in front of the City Commission in April, along with a draft version of the annual action plan. And folks get about 30 days to review that plan, comment on it. Sometime during that 30-day comment period, you'll have the public hearing here in front of the City Commission. And then the plan, once we've responded to any correspondence we've received or incorporated that into our planning, it'll come in front of the City Commission in your first City Commission meeting in May. And in there, it's a fairly lengthy plan, and so it covers a lot of the needs assessment pieces and all the correspondence with folks that we've gathered. All that information will be in there. A lot of the questions that HUD asks of us to make sure that we've got our finger on the pulse of what's happening in our community, those responses will be in there. And then also you'll see what programs are we intending to fund. And so when you approve that plan, you're also approving our application to HUD for those funds for those specific activities in the year. At the end of, the program year then starts July 1st, so we'll receive our funds. It's been a little while since we've gotten our funds on July 1st from HUD, but shortly thereafter we'll get our funds, start our new programs. In August, we begin reporting on the previous year's, the results of the previous year's funds and programs. And so we put together this report. It's called the CABR report, that talks about all the outputs and the impact of the programs from the previous year. That also will receive a public hearing in front of the City Commission. It doesn't need to be approved by the City Commission, but after we have the public hearing, we'll send that off to HUD as a requirement. And then the other event is our lead grants. The beginning of their program year starts October 1st, so those happen on a separate time frame. Some of this material will be a little bit of review from last year. I figured since we had a number of commissioners, it might help to understand how we put together our plan. And also, we do a lot of similar planning work using the same planning model. So for the 5-year consolidated plan, we do a a survey to the public. We've typically gotten around 1,000 responses. We ask lots of questions about demographics of the respondents, so we know things like the race, gender, sex, income, age, what NPC they're in, or what geographic area they're in, probably about 5 or 6 other indicators. And when we get the responses back, we are able to disaggregate all of that data by any one of those variables. So, we know our survey skews towards older folks. We get a lot of the paper versions that come back having been distributed through the water bill. But we're able to then pull out some of those subgroups that may be underrepresented and see exactly, what did these folks think about, what we're doing. So, and the questions we ask is we ask sort of a quantitative question where we just ask folks to rank 38 different community development priorities. And then we ask an open-ended question that's, if you could change one thing in your neighborhood, what would you do? And we got about 600 responses to that question last time. And our process, we analyze both the quantitative and the qualitative data. Quantitative's, just statistics, and we do cross-tabulations and that kind of stuff. With the qualitative, we actually cut those into, we go extremely old school. We cut those things up into strips of paper, and we invite the community in, NPC members, folks that serve on boards, folks that want to volunteer, people that run other agencies. We bring them in. We had a couple of big sessions over at the police department, and we just start sorting and grouping all of those different comments so that we get a sense of what were the priorities, and then we start tying those together to create root cause trees. So folks that are concerned about neighborhoods, what are those concerns made up of, right? So you can start to break that down. It's concerns about vacant buildings or about property conditions or about helping people in need, parks or public spaces, lighting, that kind of thing. And then all of that information is used for our 5-year plan. This last time we put together a 17-person strategy team, largely made up of folks that do strategic planning around community development work in the city or in the county, in the area. And we went to work on creating a set of strategic priorities. And we use a process called pairwise comparison, where you first lay out what your priorities are to start. And in this instance, this report card here shows 6 categories at the top. So affordable housing is one, anti-poverty strategy is another, neighborhood vitality, these kinds of things. Once you have those, pairwise comparison has you compare everything you value to everything else you say you value. And so you do that comparison for every single thing you value. So first you would start with affordable housing. Which is more important, addressing affordable housing or anti-poverty strategies in your community? And the first time we had that conversation, it was an hour and a half long. And we had 72 more comparisons to do after that, right? So, and we just locked everybody in for 2 or 3 days. And what that does is it forces you to sort of cover every single angle around the things that you value. And everybody gets a chance to talk about when you build consensus that way. We've got a bit of software that records our decision making and then does the calculations and creates this weighted scorecard. And so the items in yellow at the top are strategic priorities. The items in green are objectives, strategic objectives inside of those priorities. So if you look at affordable housing, it's going to be made up of, for us, this may not be the same in every community, but for us, ensuring that we had safe rental housing, increasing the number and diversity of housing options in the city. We've got really homogeneous housing stock and housing options, particularly in the rental sector. So just creating more diversity means you're able to meet more needs of folks. And those, along every income level, we would benefit from having more diverse options, right? Increasing access to attainable housing and preserving and maintaining the units that we have, our current housing stock. So you can see affordable housing ended up being weighted the highest priority at 28%. And once we've created this scorecard and we've got those weights, the idea is that when you go to spend money, you're going to basically spend it along those lines. So the expectation is that we'd spend 28% of our funds on items that are going to further affordable and accessible housing. We develop criteria, specific criteria around each of those objectives. How do we know when we're being successful? And we want some tangible items. Is it a certain number of folks that achieve X? Is it a certain amount of folks that benefit or get housed? And we create a whole bunch of outcomes for each one of these objectives. We create a scoring guide that looks a little like this, where all those things are laid out, something we can hand out to someone who has a project idea and say, here's you can look through this and figure out how to align your project idea with our consolidated plan. And then we begin scoring projects. And we don't just, if we have a, like the minor home repair program sounds like a housing idea, but we don't just score it against our housing value. We also score it against all the other values that we have. And what this does is it's not just about what you're going to fund, it's about how you're going to implement the program. And it evaluates how are you doing the things that you do. It was very valuable to us. The first time we scored this, a lot of the things we've been funding for a long time scored really poorly. And a lot of that was because we weren't putting much thought into how we were doing things. It was much more about, well, this is a housing program, we have a housing need, that's good. And so some items we figured we needed to retool or rethink how we were doing things, and some items we just needed to stop funding. And so if you look at this chart, it's a lot of small writing, you don't have to know what all these programs are, but the ones in gray are things that we just stopped funding or ideas we considered chose not to fund. Items in blue were things that we scored and we funded with consolidated plan dollars. And then after we created the plan and chose what we were going to fund, we continued scoring ideas. And we've actually scored a lot more ideas than just what's on the page here. But by doing that, we started to notice a trend. A lot of the ideas that were scoring the highest were actually community-based ideas coming from the community to us. And a lot of times these ideas weren't rising to the top or getting on people's radar because maybe the organization didn't have a track record of having implemented such an idea. Or maybe they lacked some capacity and they were going to need to build it. Or maybe the idea was really aspirational. And so that didn't cure any of those concerns. What it did tell us was that if we funded that idea, it could well be the most strategic or have the highest strategic value of anything we fund. So it suddenly caused us to take a second look at what we were funding, start to consider some of these projects. What are the ones that could be elevated? Where can we build this capacity? And it sort of changed how we were approaching projects coming our way. And then the second piece is by scoring projects, it gave us a way to respond to people that were coming. And we have folks come in our office all the time with an idea about how they'd like to change Battle Creek. And so we can say, hey, listen, we may not have funds coming available for, there may not be a way for you to get some revenue from us, but one thing we can do is sit down and we can see, how does your project idea align with the priorities of our consolidated plan? And if you're going to go somewhere else looking for funding, we can say, this is a highly strategic idea, and here's why. This is how it fits into what we're doing. This is why this would be a really valuable program. And that's been really helpful. A lot of folks have come forward. We've used this for grant applications to MISTA for NEP grants. Those are about $50,000 a pop. I think one of them, one grantee has done this so many times they're now eligible for $80,000 per grant. And we've had 5 of those using this process and helping them with some of the data. So it's been a great way to bring some resources into our community and help build the capacity of those local organizations to build, to do housing work. This is just a spreadsheet of the things that we intend to fund. This is the last 3 years of our consolidated plan. 2023 is the year that we're going to be proposing that you'll weigh in on in May. I'll talk a little bit more about a few of these, but this just gives you an idea. Minor home repair, facility improvement, code compliance, some public services, housing case management. There's a case management project that we started with VOSIS where they're providing housing navigator and advocacy and interpretation for Hispanic and Latino families. So this is their first foray into housing work. And it's produced some pretty exciting results we'll talk about in a minute. And so I just want to go through a few of the projects. This is the Youth Village Learning Center located on Van Buren. It will be located on Van Buren, on the corner of Van Buren and Kendall. This is just a quick graph that shows how this scored. It's not a housing idea, but it is activating vacant land in our community. It's along a key corridor coming into downtown. If you look at the objectives under land activation, it scores really high in almost every one of those categories. And so we're funding a learning center. It's a child care facility. So a lot of folks are thinking of this is about daycare, but it's not just about daycare. This is the reason why this is such a high scoring idea, is because it's also about redeveloping a key area of our community and other things. The other piece is it's an anti-poverty strategy. Just because I'm poor doesn't mean I can't have access to quality daycare, right? It's a community empowerment project. It's a part of a comprehensive plan for 8 blocks, and most of that plan has been a part of a community vision, right, where a lot of the community and a lot of the youth were brought together to help develop that idea. And when you look at the community engagement there and see all the different metrics that it's hitting, it's really quite impressive. So even though it's got 3 categories where it's not scoring any points at all, it's really hitting on the other 3. A 43 is a really highly strategic project idea in our view. And then its current status, we funded $420,000 of this project last year, and we spread our funding over 2 years. So the idea is we're going to be proposing $70,000 for this year, which would finish off the $490,000 we had allocated in the consolidated plan. Currently, they've completed their phase 1 environmental work, and they're in sort of pre-development work with engineers and architects putting together the final plans, working with our planning department, our planning division. Our hope is that it'll start somewhere at 23 and with a completion date early to mid 2024. This is our minor home repair program, which we've had for a really long time. It provides up to $5,000 worth of assistance for eligible repairs. We can replace furnaces. We can lift a meter out of the pit, which is a lot of folks have had to do that. So we're able, for low and moderate income families, we can help them with that piece. We'll increase the amount that we'll grant to $15,000 if it involves a new roof or is paired with lead abatement funds to do a lead abatement project. So to qualify, applicants must own their own home, have income below 80% of area median income, which is about $57,000 for a family of 4. They got to have insurance, and they can't be in forfeiture on their taxes. So they could be up to a year late, and we'll still do the project. And this is a housing idea, or a housing project, but it actually doesn't score terribly high in our our attainable housing area. And it's because it's mostly focused on preserving housing, which is something we value and care about. But there are a lot of other things that we value in that category, and this doesn't hit on them. Where it scores really high is in the category of anti-poverty strategy. And this is because a lot of the folks that we serve are seniors. A lot of them are on fixed income. And if we're able to sustain them in their neighborhood where they've been for a long time, they've got social networks, their whole life has been organized for a long time in that one place, and we can keep them there rather than them having to go maybe for a more expensive option or something completely new or something that takes them away from their networks. That's helping folks sustain them towards the end of their lives in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. So just because I'm poor doesn't mean that I can't have that kind of experience. And us doing a roof on a property, it's a big deal. In the neighborhood vitality section, the reason why that scores so high is because this is also a vacant buildings intervention strategy. Folks defer maintenance on a roof. They'll do it for 10 or 15 years because they will have no way to pay for it. And they'll just keep figuring out, how do I get by, even with the roof leaking? And the roof will leak for 5, 6, 7 years, and by the time we're actually called in, or by the time they pass away, or the house, they have to leave the home and the house has to get sold, there's almost nothing we can do with it. And then we end up paying $15,000 for a demolition. So one of the ways that we've cut down on demolitions, and vacant buildings are at an all-time low in Battle Creek, since probably the mid-'80s. We don't have good data earlier than that, but I'm just guessing based on the trends. We're at an all-time low in terms of the number of vacant buildings in Battle Creek. And that's one of the ways that we got there. Right? Turn the faucet off before you start figuring out what to do about the flood damage, so that's been a part of This just gives an idea of, so we did 46 projects in the last program year. 35% of these were African American, 11% were Hispanic or Latino. I mentioned that we had this partnership with VOSIS through a grant that we funded. We also have hired 2 bilingual interpreters on staff. A lot of our materials that we're putting out, we're not doing like an English and a Spanish version anymore. We're just doing both languages on the same flyer, and every material's got Spanish on it. We wanted to have, if you go past our office on your way out tonight, take a look at the display there. We Speak Spanish is on there so folks know they can come into the office. And then also all the materials, Spanish is right there. And we just want to just change the way we can, we convey who we are and who we're here to serve. We want to make sure that everyone in our community feels like they're welcome and we're here for them. And so the most that we've ever spent of our resources on Hispanic and Latino families in a year was 3%. That was 1 year in all the times that I've been here. And other than that, it was been 1% or 2% of our resources. So to have 11% of our resources, this program is a great step forward. This year we're already seeing, I think it was 17% of lead abatement applications were Hispanic and Latino families. So we're excited about that. Rental repair, we've had a rental rehab program for a long time. We've had a hard time moving the money. The focus has been on renovating like downtown spaces or redeveloping some of these spaces above businesses and mixed use areas. And a lot of great things have happened as a result of this program. Almost none of them count towards our goals or lead to expenditure. Like we've helped people knock down barriers to getting apartments, but our funds have strings tied to them that sometimes folks don't want to work with, or it just becomes, it doesn't make sense. There's always this calculus we have to go through, or rules about having to relocate families and stuff like that that cause challenges. And so I think we tried to implement this ourselves. We brought in a consultant to help us do it. Then we finally just hired a consultant to run the whole thing because they were an expert. And it's just been too challenging. We have a couple of active projects we expect to finish up this year, so we'll have some results. But we'd like to retool the program, give out smaller amounts of money, make it accessible, focus more on rental properties in neighborhoods. I mean, we have an issue right now with folks being able to get access to housing. Part of that is folks will take a look at how the source of payment that folks have. If they're on Section 8, they'll just reject them on that. And in Battle Creek, that's legal. It's okay to do. We're going to just make it a condition. If you take our money, fix your roof, whatever else, we're going to ask you not to discriminate based on source of income. So that's just a requirement. And then it also ensures that the rents will be affordable. They have to charge a fair market rate. And they'll have to rent to tenants that make 80% or below median income. And so another thing for us is if you go into a lot of the downtown neighborhoods, if you see a roof that's in really bad shape, more than likely it's a rental property. And that's because we've done 300 to 350 roofs in the last 10 years. We've gotten, and those are some of the worst roofs in neighborhoods. If they're an owner-occupied house, we've connected with them and we've repaired a really bad roof. So some of this is just addressing what are some of the most blighting conditions in the neighborhood by getting in there, getting in with that rental property. The last piece is we have these lead grants where we can do work in rental housing, but especially our HUD money, it doesn't allow us to do rehab work alongside of the rental. And it's made it so that some folks aren't taking advantage of our lead programs, taking advantage of those resources. The HUD one in particular really just focuses on addressing lead. So if you have 4 walls in a room and only one of the walls has lead paint, HUD will only let us abate the lead on that wall and paint that one wall. We can't touch any of the other walls. And it just leaves really bizarre sort of circumstances where we could go in and abate all the lead, but they got a hole in the roof and we can't do anything about that. So we haven't had money to be able to go in those situations, or have had very little money to go in those situations and do some incidental rehab. Hey, let's protect the lead work we're doing by fixing the roof. Let's take care of some of the other healthy homes issues that we see. Let's finish off the whole room so we're not leaving them with something that looks, that doesn't look right. And by retooling this rent repair program, part of what we'd like to do is, where we're already doing a lead abatement project, we'd like to be able to pair money in those instances and have these programs work together. I want to talk a little bit about why we fund code enforcement. Jason Francisco is going to be doing a presentation on code enforcement through an equity lens to the Human Relations Board next month. So we're looking forward to that. And I didn't want to step on his toes. But I did feel like there was a space for me to talk about why do we fund code enforcement? Why is that important to us? And so one thing that doesn't get talked about enough is code enforcement is an extremely cheap strategy when it comes to a housing intervention. The bang for the buck is considerable. If we do a big rehab, everyone gets all excited, sees this big, beautiful house redone, the substantial rehabs we did with NSP. We know that for every $1 we spent, we got $3 in return in terms of increasing property values around those homes. When we do a demolition, on average in Battle Creek, the 1,000 or so demolitions we did through NSP and the other programs that we got, that we had, we get about a $14 return for every buck that we put in. You can't demolish your way to a successful community, but when you're doing it strategically and using it in the right places, that's the kind of return that we can expect to see. Code compliance, we don't have any hard evidence because it's hard to measure those, like scientifically measure those tiny little interventions, but our feeling and consensus around the country is, amongst community development professionals, is that code compliance is far more efficient in terms of the return you get for your dollar. The other thing is that it works to scale. We can do, if we're strategic, we can do rehabs in a targeted area and see that kind of return. We had to be very strategic about where we did that. We wanted to do them in the same area so that we could start to see the whole neighborhood turnover. We did that on the historic north side for NSP. Code compliance, in the city of Battle Creek, we're touching every single property every 3 years. We're inspecting rental properties. 94% of rental properties get inspected every 3 or 6 years. So we're touching all the properties and we're ensuring that they are at maintain a minimum standard for health and safety. Anecdotally, from my community organizing days, which a lot of that time was spent in this community in the first decade of the century, working with community groups, going around photographing all of their vacant and dangerous buildings, doing windshield surveys of the property conditions. I still have all that data, and I still have all those pictures. And if I go to an NPC meeting and someone says, this is the worst it's ever looked, I say, all right, I've got those pictures. I'm going to bring those back, and we're going to look at them. See if you can find 81 vacant buildings in the Post neighborhood that look like this. And they know darn well that's not the case. And that's largely because we've got a vacant buildings ordinance that we enforce, and because we've got rental registration that we enforce. And so it's a big deal. For us, we focus on pairing code compliance with our minor home repair program, so we get a lot of referrals that way. We're most concerned about what happens in the areas on this map. We give them names related to an NPC, but some of the target areas are much smaller than the NPC. And for these, we track a set of 8 health indicators to determine how well are these neighborhoods doing. Are they in decline or are they improving? We used that data to determine these boundaries, because these were all neighborhoods that were in decline or at a high risk of decline in 2015 or 16 when we set them. And so some neighborhoods are doing so well that the next time we set these in the next couple of years, they will probably get left off because they have improved greatly. Folks might expect this would score high with attainable housing or neighborhood vitality, but this is one of the best anti-poverty strategies that we've got. And people don't think about this being an anti-poverty strategy, and I guarantee it is. Just because I'm poor doesn't mean I have to live in a substandard rental. Just because I'm poor doesn't mean I have to live next to a blighted building, have to worry about a vacant building that my kids can get access to, live in a rundown or dilapidated neighborhood. And this is helping to ensure that that's the case. Also, that chart there is showing that the green line are houses right now, as of this morning, with open code violations. What percentage of them are owner-occupied? 30% of the open code violations are owner-occupied. If you couple that with the fact that only 5%, like we studied some data in 2018 and 2019, only 5% of the enforcements that we do in a year result in a citation. So someone actually having to pay something or go to court or that kind of thing. So we're talking about a very small, of all the interventions or interactions that we have, a very small percent of them are resulting in some kind of action like that. And of those, 30% of them are homeowners. So a lot of that activity is happening around rental properties and about ensuring that those are meeting a minimum standard, and a very small group of them are around homeowners. And I just don't think that's very well understood either, because I think that's a big concern we have, is who is this impacting? Because a code compliance activity could force someone to take on a project that they weren't ready to handle. They may have a resource problem and couldn't deal with it that way. And so our concern is, if we're catching up a lot of folks in that kind of thing, then that's something we might want to think about or address. So, we have a data system called Neighborhood Intel. It used to be put on by Dynamometrics, but they got bought up. So we're actually considering upgrading this and moving to a system with some more functionality. But this is a pretty great system as it is. It's been open to the public for the last 4 or 5 years. You can see the different indicators that we track when we're tracking neighborhood health. So I just got a little bit of data to share about sort of where we stand in terms of Battle Creek neighborhoods. This is all the home sales that happened in 2022. On the graph on the left-hand side just shows the average residential sales price price per square foot. And that's a measure we like to use because it controls for house size. It also corresponds when folks are doing development. They often talk about what's it going to cost you to build that per square foot, right? So that's it's a good way to measure how much is this valued right now, these property, and then we can also take a look at, well, how much does it cost to replace it, right? And this graph is showing the difference between the city average value and the average value of just owner-occupied properties throughout the city. And you can see that this data in the graph goes through the third quarter of last year, so it includes 1 quarter of data after interest rates began to rise, and we started to hear about the housing market was cooling, and definitely the housing market in terms of sales volume started to cool. But values still continued to rise. You know, we're going to be keeping a careful eye on that. In a couple days or a couple weeks, we'll get the last quarter's data, and that'll start to give us an indicator. Is it starting to drop, or is it going to level off? You know, the areas that have had the most growth, you know, Urbandale has doubled in value from 2010. So it was maybe 30% or 40% the city average. I shared this stat last year, and now it's even with the city. Or I think actually in the last a couple quarters last year, it's now higher than the city. And so, what's that? Yeah, right. It's doing well. It's doing very well. You know, the areas circled on this map are areas where values are rising higher than anywhere else in the city based on percentage. So you actually have a map of that. So this is a map of the darker the green. Those are the areas that are increasing in value. You know, it's a comparison, a 5-year comparison. And you can see most of those, the areas that are increasing in value the most are downtown neighborhoods or Urbandale. This is another piece. As we were putting this presentation together, we noticed that smaller homes are now valued higher based on that per square foot measure than larger homes. So in 2010, you know, about $70 to $75 per square foot is what we valued houses over 1,200 square feet. And smaller homes were right around a little over 50. And now you can see that blue line represents smaller homes or homes under 1,200 square feet. And you can see that they're now valued higher than larger homes. And I just find it interesting because it's a sign that we're moving, that slowly there's this trend sort of separate of the pandemic or of housing crises that we've had. There's this just sort of separate trend that's happening where we're moving towards living in smaller homes or valuing more. There's greater demand for smaller homes. This is that Urbandale stat, so you can see Urbandale is the green line on this chart. We showed the slide last year, but there's been a year of additional data, so I thought I'd include it. This slide looks at occupancy for Neighborhood Planning Council 3. So this is the area where Wilson Elementary used to be, Coburn Elementary used to be, Territorial Elementary used to be, Roosevelt Elementary used to be.
You have a good memory.
What's that?
You have a good memory.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see that coming out of the foreclosure crisis in 2010, a sharp decline in occupancy rates. The city and the NPC both, they both started at the same place, and they both recovered. We've got the highest occupancy rates in recent history anyway, and but there has been some separation in terms of how the city as a whole has improved over that time and where NPC3 is at. Like that's about a 1.5 percentage point difference. And when you're talking occupancy rates, that's significant. You're talking about hundreds of homes, right, that are unoccupied. That if this had been following the city trend, they would be occupied and aren't. We've got a couple of other special initiatives that we wanted to hit on. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Home ARP funds, so I'll do that real quickly. And we talked a little bit about our team and the location in City Hall, so I don't think we have to cover that. We do have a lead awareness website I want to talk about. We've moved all of our applications online, which we had done and sort of announced when we came into this, but we hadn't set it up yet. We hadn't begun getting applications. We'll touch on that. And then we're now managing all of our programs in an online environment as well, so it's kind of nice. So just an overview of our Home ARP spending. Again, this is focused on addressing the needs of the homeless. We were able to fund 4 different types of activities with these dollars. We could preserve affordable housing. We could do tenant-based rental assistance. We could fund supportive services to the homeless, and we could purchase and develop non-congregate shelter. And so we went through a pretty extensive just some quick stats about some homeless facts. We have roughly 3,000 homeless individuals. I think that's folks served over the course of a year. 950 homeless school-age children over the course of a year. Roughly 2,440 households at or below 30% AMI and have 1 or more housing problems. So, I would actually pass over that one. So we did help the Homeless Coalition locally prepare a strategic value scorecard based around their plan to end homelessness. So it was their strategic plan. We turned it into a scorecard using the process we had before. And instead of measuring the project ideas for these Home ARP dollars against our scorecard, we measured these project ideas around theirs. And so it's a highly collaborative environment. You've got a lot of different organizations and agencies participated in that, so that seemed to make some sense. So the kinds of things that came out of our process, we did lots of consultations with folks that were homeless, folks that worked in agencies, frontline staff, executive directors, participants in the Homeless Coalition. We had them fill out surveys. We did one-on-one interviews with them. We invited them to come together in group sessions, and we did a couple of public workshop sessions and also went to a couple of their meetings. So we got a lot of input. We did a public hearing last year at this time as well, where a lot of them showed up and provided some input. The 2 things that really rose out of those discussions was we wanted to strengthen local supportive services for people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness through providing case management, housing navigation, substance abuse recovery coaching, and peer support. And these really spoke to, there's just a lot of folks that have some challenges getting into housing. And there's just a variety of things, and there are a number of agencies that all of them were saying there needs to be more supports for these folks accessing housing. The other priority was just a lack of permanent supportive housing. This is housing that is designed for folks that are going to have some challenges sustaining themselves in housing long term. They're going to need some support, and this housing has all of those supports and services delivered on site so that folks are able to succeed in staying in their housing long term. So we did end up selecting 6 projects. The one that scored the highest was a proposal by Upholdings. It's a developer that builds permanent supportive housing in the Midwest. Well, actually, I think across the country. We were providing $365,000 of gap financing for what would probably be about a $10 million project. It'd be a 50 to 60 unit development, and has live-in staff that are available for residents or staff that come and provide services on site for residents to help them overcome the barriers to long-term housing. That proposal, you know, they have to line up a lot of other funding in order for that project to work. So that's one that's going to take longer to develop. We've got plenty of time. Our money is pretty patient. So we're going to let them secure that financing and then come back to us with a more specific proposal. And then when that happens, it will come in front of the City Commission, and you will review it and choose whether or not to approve it.
Do you know where the location of that housing will be?
They haven't determined the location yet. They've been working closely with Ted on a number. I know that they've taken a look at a number of different locations. So, yeah, that's obviously going to be an important piece. You know, both making sure that we find a location that really is best suited to meet the needs of the folks that we're trying to support, as well as making sure it's, you know, compatible with nearby uses and that kind of thing. So. I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that.
Yeah, I would just add, Mayor, that they're looking at some different pots of money to help fund a project here in Battle Creek. And with those different pots of money, the scoring criteria has changed a little bit, which actually makes some projects in Battle Creek a little bit stronger. But it also has made them pivot a little bit in their thinking about whether they build new or actually rehab an existing facility. So they're exploring some additional sites.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. The other grants that we made funded, that actually switched to a different grant. Okay, just the other pieces that we funded are largely supportive services. And so that's divided amongst 5 different local agencies. And based on those grants, we're expecting
That means you've gone too long, Chris.
have a slide away.
It's fireworks.
We're expected to assist 550 individuals through those programs. So, and then our CDBG-CD grants, these are just some of the statistics, or some of the outcomes from those grants. The number of homeless individuals, 437 individuals that were provided shelter, really constructed low-barrier homeless shelters using our funds. 85 households that received eviction diversion services through legal services. 285 individuals provided overnight shelter and using hotel vouchers. And the list goes on. If it's been sent out, you can take a look at that. But just touched a lot of people's lives with those funds, and we do have a lot of really good organizations, so we're able to put those dollars in their hands and are able to make them stretch for sure. You know, we do have a website. The whole thing translates to Spanish with a push of a button. It does immediately. Anywhere on any one of those website pages for the lead programs, it'll hook you into an application to be able to access resources. And that's some of our key contact information.
Any questions for Chris? Comments? Yes, Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Chris, on the slide that you had regarding funding, there's about $2 million or so that are CARES, and I'm assuming ARP is American Recovery.
That's right.
So are we expecting those to be sustainable? Are those are one-time dollars, I'm assuming?
They're one-time
and when
dollars.
they're gone, and so those programs we'll have to figure out. They may be grayed out in future.
Yeah, so the CDBG-CV, it was just emergency funds, and they were really just getting thrown into the gap because right when they were put out. The funds that we're getting now with the Home Art funds are getting distributed, you know, after a lot of the crisis has passed. And so we we made it so that folks could submit proposals for services that would happen over the course of 3 years, up to 3 years.
Okay.
So, we don't have to have all this funds spent down until 2030, actually. So so many of these grants are actually for multiple years.
Okay.
So, it gives them some time if there are things that they want to sustain, or it gives them 3 years to do some really good work.
Thank you.
Commissioner Simmons?
So I have a few questions, but maybe if we're doing multiple rounds, I don't want to monopolize any time, so we can come back. But we talked about small home value going up, which if you're a homeowner, that's great. If I want to sell, I'm doing really well. If you're a moderate income working family that are looking to get into the entry level of homes, we have it's a supply and demand thing, and we have an extreme shortage. From what I hear when I talk to people that are trying to find housing in our community, that segment, and there are other segments that we struggle with as well, multifamily, but that particular segment, I'm very concerned about. Nobody's building moderately priced homes now. If you're going to build something that's $300,000-$400,000, if not more.
Yeah.
And those, we just have, it's an aging stock, and we have, you mentioned Urbandale, and I saw on the map, it looks like Old Lakeview. A lot of folks would like, that's kind of where they like to start. And it's just not, it's becoming less and less possible for working families to access that American dream of home ownership. So it's not so much a question as you're tracking this, I'm sure, and what's our solution, or what do we foresee happening in the future in this realm?
Yeah, so, I was talking to Krista Edwards at the Land Bank this morning, specifically asking her, just to make sure my data was on point for this presentation, but she, in discussions with MEDC last week, they were saying that low-end housing development, new housing development on a slab using contractor-grade materials is about $225 a square foot to build, which is outrageous.
Right.
We don't have, there's almost nowhere in Battle Creek where you can build something new, go where something already exists and build something new for the same price. You just can't do that. And so, I think a lot of folks are grappling with them. What do you do? And folks are looking at maybe if we're building some new units, maybe they're smaller units, or maybe we're finding more efficient ways to build. But I mean, honestly, you're talking about an enormous gap. And Ted actually has a lot of is a part of a lot of these conversations that happen locally around these particular problems. So you might have something to add around that. But I think it's going to be a really challenging problem for us. And I think that we're far more likely to be able to create more rental housing for folks, and homeownership might take a hit, or we might see more rental housing, single-family homes convert to home ownership as a way. There are opportunities in Battle Creek. Housing is still, I mean, you can. If someone is looking for a bargain, they can go find one in some of our downtown neighborhoods. They can go into some of the neighborhoods that I circled, Keith Drive, right, where houses were selling 5 years ago for $60,000. They may pay a little bit more for them, but they're going to have something that they can afford. They're going to want to put a little money into it and fix it up, right? Or folks that are already there are going to start fixing it up so that they could sell it. I mean, I don't know what to say about how does home ownership continue the way our housing delivery is currently set. I mean, that's a bigger issue that I think we can address with community development. We can try and incentivize some things, but I actually think us pouring all of our money into single-family housing development, we're going to try some things with infill housing because we think it can fill a gap in a neighborhood and improve a neighborhood. But I think in terms of approaching, like using infill housing to figure out how do we just help an individual, that's throwing a lot of money, and our chances of getting to scale are pretty challenging. So without innovation, right? Rethinking the way that we're living, rethinking the way that we're building new housing. So I think and Ted could probably shed some light on that too. The thing I am focused on, where I think there's incredible opportunity that we've never had before since I've been here, is this is a great time for us to be thinking, how do we preserve affordability for folks that are already in these neighborhoods? A lot of folks are low income, already own their home, And, their taxes can only grow at a certain rate. That's me trying to look at the glass as half full, all right, so.
Thank you.
Commissioner Reynolds?
Mayor.
I'm sorry.
No,
Mayor.
Come back to you.
my question was already answered. Thank you.
Very good. Roger? Commissioner Ballard?
It's okay. I've got two questions, but they kind of tie together. You had mentioned earlier about a ratio of 14 to 1 and a 3 to 1 dollars.
Yeah.
Could you reiterate that? I was kind of lost a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the neighborhood intel system, one of the original reasons why we got that application is because on the front end, they did this analysis. That system knows 25 things about an individual house. Does it have a chimney? How many bedrooms? What's the square footage? It knows 25 things about a house. It knows 50 things about the neighborhood it's in. How many rentals are within 500 feet? Am I next to a blighted building? It knows all these things about the neighborhood. They do this sophisticated regression analysis to determine what things, what factors, what variables affect the value of neighbors. And then what they can do is they can determine if you have a blighted property or an abandoned property in this neighborhood and you turn it into the best house on the block, how is that going to affect surrounding property values? So it does an analysis of when we did that, when we implemented those intervention strategies, what kind of value did we create in that neighborhood as a result of that particular activity? And then it also creates a predictive tool. And they need sizable interventions or ones that happen in significant enough numbers to be able to evaluate it. And so I was telling you what the results were for those two different intervention types.
So the 14 to 1, putting a dollar out, you're getting 14 back was what, home ownership?
Well, if I have a blighted property, a stinker of a property in an otherwise decent neighborhood, and we tear that house down, for every dollar we spend on that activity, because it's a relatively, compared to a substantial rehab of a property, it's relatively inexpensive. So you get a $14 return on your $1. For every dollar we spent on that activity, we could expect $14 of increased value in the neighborhood around that property.
By keeping it one instead of tearing it down.
No, that's a demolition. If you demolish a blighted property, the model breaks down once you demolish everything, obviously, right? Then we have no neighborhood, nobody's increasing. So it's got to be in a strategic, it's basically strategic instances where if you're next to a blighted property, you're going to have a very hard time selling your own, right?
Right.
So.
Okay. The second question is some of our neighboring communities have built some of these single-person homes for homeless or people, I guess it's homeless people. Have we any plans for that or any areas that we've even considered about doing something on that level? They sound like they're like, maybe a 400 square foot house? I mean, it's really tiny.
Yeah. So my understanding is that the planning division, like a previous commission, did reduce the size, the minimum size of a home so that it could afford for smaller development. That happened in recent years. All right, I'm getting a couple nods, so I feel comfortable saying that. And then generally, my experience has been that the planning division has been pretty amenable to those and really tried to seek out those folks that are looking at those kinds of models in the community. And there have been a number of them, a number of folks that have shown some interest in that idea. Amongst the homeless coalition, the folks serving the homeless, I've never seen it get beyond that stage. And then when we had these home art funds where we possibly could have done something like that, we did score a particular idea that was brought to us by a group of homeless individuals. And it was based on a model out of Portland. And they scored it with me, and by the time they got done, they felt like there were other things that we should spend our money on. So, I don't think it's going away.
Is that because of the lack of number of homeless people that they said that, or?
No, I think it would be a good idea. It's just that the idea of doing permanent supportive housing was a better fit for our community's needs right now. So, also, our dollars could be meaningful, filling a gap to get a larger investment.
I see.
So that's where those kinds of dollars ended up going.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Any other, Commissioner O'Donnell?
I just had a quick question. Do you do quality of life studies of how the neighborhoods are, like if you put in a park or another like activity area, how it increases or decreases the value and brings people into those neighborhoods? Do you do those type of studies? That's all.
Yeah, some aspects of quality of life we might address. I'm trying to think of like what would be a good example. It's hard. I would love to do something around.
Well, like we put in a splash pad recently. I
Yeah,
mean,
I'm
stuff
trying-
like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what's an example of some way in which we've tried to study that. So like we would like to be able to do park usage, but how do you calculate park usage? And we just haven't had the tools to be. I talked to Parks and Rec to see if they had done something. Most recently, about a year ago, myself and John Hart in Economic Development looked into some of the data providers that work with data on cell phones, where they can actually track who's using certain amenities in the community and where are they coming from and going to. And John wanted to build all these enormous businesses and do all these cool things. I was thinking about parks, because we've never been able. The linear trail, wouldn't it be great to know who's using the linear trail? Where do they come from? What are the demographics there, and how often is it getting used? Maybe start to figure out how could we change that or market it so that our parks were being used more. Which parks are being used by folks coming from out of town, and for what purposes? Because it can get down to, are they on the playground? Are they walking around the track? Unfortunately, that software is extremely expensive.
I just wondered if that was just something like accessibility to the linear trail, to other parks, the dog park, how those affect.
The dog park would be amazing, wouldn't it? To be able to
Yeah,
have some
just
hard
to have,
data about
that
usage.
kind of data to show. I mean, I really do enjoy your presentation of all this, but part of the land usage is land activity and possibly other parks or amenities for like a smaller, we have farmers market downtown, but smaller gathering places, I would guess we would call it, throughout the city, that type of thing. Just,
I'm interested. So far it's been kind of beyond my means to be able to do so, but I remain interested. We do know who values those kinds of things, because in our survey we ask folks who cares about tree maintenance on streets, power lines, lights, parks. It turns out that younger people care about those things the most. And every 10 years you get older, the less you care about those things. And that's what our survey shows. It's like a linear progression, and it's happened both times. So.
thank you.
Any other commission comments or questions? Chris?
So I talked about small home value for home ownership. Big concern also, and obviously I'm hearing from your presentation, it's a concern of yours as well for rental, whether it be multifamily, single family rentals. 4 or 5 years ago, I heard a statistics that said that, and I can't remember what the exact number was, like 300 or 600 new units needed to be coming online in Battle Creek to meet the demand. I don't see that has happened. And that, I mean, that's a large volume. And not to diminish anything you're doing here, but it's just kind of picking around the periphery, and there's just a much larger need. So maybe it's not in the purview of your department.
It's not really.
It's not. But, okay, well, let's talk about this one aspect of the rental. I saw on a couple of the slides talked about eviction diversion. And one of the problems that I hear that many have, that they've already been evicted. Now they can't get another rental because of their past history. And do we have any kind of programs for those folks that maybe some kind of financial education and some kind of guarantee, some entity will help them get in? Because I know a lot of the folks are still using the hotels and motels for housing because they can't get into other rentals, past history, convictions from felonies and that kind of thing. So perhaps you can address that.
Yeah, so we have looked into trying to do a number of different strategies. The trick is being able to use federal dollars for that purpose. The one thing we thought, one idea we think may have some promise is basically finding some way to kind of ensure the additional risk for the landlord.
Right.
And there's different ways that you could do that. One, we could step in The problem is the strings attached to our funds don't give us, it's hard to get really creative.
Yeah.
You know, the sensible thing would have some kind of back an insurance fund where you take on this tenant, it's a part of our agreement. If the unit gets trashed or there's some consequence, then we help cover the gap on that, right? Or the consequences of that outcome. But we can't use our federal dollars in that way. So we've tried to think of like other ways. Could we come in and do a rehab? We tried to come up with some other ways. The bottom line is CDBG funds and a lot of the HUD funds just aren't real suitable to that purpose, and we would need some kind of change. And like we need more people to be thinking about this idea. And the good news is that public housing authorities in California have started to explore this. They actually have a little bit more flexibility with some of their funding, and they've been able to do it in order to get landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers. So our public housing authority is aware of some of those efforts. Really what I think will need to happen is that people start to see that as an effective way of creating helping to get more of those folks into housing, and then HUD starts to realize we need to create some more, like an easier way to do these kinds of interventions.
Right.
So I don't know in the short term, but we talk about it pretty regularly. I mean, it's
something I hear
it's a
about
problem.
regularly.
It's a problem.
Absolutely.
A lot of
Well,
our
and if you get
supportive
those-
services are helping folks, but it doesn't get over that added risk that a landlord's going to take on.
Sure.
So.
Maybe some kind of third-party collaboration to ensure that.
Chris, we want to say thank you.
Yeah.
Your report is filled with all types of information that's good for the community, so thank you.
Thanks for giving me the time. I really appreciate it, and we'll be in front of you in the coming months.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, we'll take a break and gather again in about 25 minutes for the remainder of our meeting. Thank you very much.